So welcome everyone to today's program in celebration of International Women's Day, hosted by the World Affairs Council and the Women's Leadership Center at the University of St. Joseph. I'm Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Today, we couldn't have a more timely discussion for International Women's Day as we focus on a conversation on global trade featuring Ann Evans and Dr. Rhona Free. Two wonderful people who I know so many are familiar with, but quickly, Anne is the CEO of Universal Strategies, and many of you know Anne as from her time as the head of the United States Department of Commerce here in Connecticut, during which time she drove Connecticut's economic recovery through the recession. And of course, Dr. Rhona Free, who is the president of the University of St. Joseph and economist and an economist herself. So she is the perfect person to lead today's discussion. Today's event is a part of an ongoing collaboration between the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and the Women's Leadership Center at the University of St. Joseph, where each year we join forces to recognize International Women's Day and highlight women who are making an impact on the world. For the discussion today, I know a lot of you have so many questions. Please get those ready and please put them in the Q&A button and keep them as succinct as possible so we can get to as many as possible. I'm looking forward to the discussion and handing it right over to you, Rhona.
All right, well, thank you very much, Megan. Thanks for this continued collaboration. And Anne, thank you very much for being a part of this webinar today. So we will get to talking about tariffs and international trade, but you had such an interesting career path, starting with your family's tire business to your current roles as CEO of Universal Strategies, senior advisor at World Business Capital. So can you talk a little bit about your career path? How did you decide to go into the family business, and then how did things evolve from there?
Well, first of all, thank you both Rhona and Megan and the audience for inviting me to join you today. I'm really honored. I'm just a girl from Eastern Connecticut. I keep reminding people that. I share a real common story with many people who left other careers to join the family business. My dad got ill and somebody had to do that. And nearly 50 years ago, I was happily working in political campaigns in Washington. And I was about to join George Bush's first presidential campaign in January 1979. And my dad got sick. And I returned to the family business, which was a very large retreading facility and retail stores and one of the largest Firestone distributors in the area. The tire industry was plagued with issues in 1979. It was the beginning of radialization. I would imagine that most people on this call don't even remember tires before there were radial tires. And we had one of the largest retreading plants. And they were faced with recalls, cheap imported tires, something we're going to be talking about again, manufacturing mergers, and waste tire disposal issues. And there was also a real lack of leadership in the tire industry. And these were opportunities. They weren't as much plagued issues, and I kind of took up the challenge. First thing I saw was that it cost me about $16 to retread a tire in Middletown, Connecticut. But I could buy imported tires brand new from some companies and countries that were starting up for like $18. And most of my customers were much happier buying a brand new tire than a retread. So we really started the whole wave of importing tires, one of the first groups to start importing tires from emerging economies and bring them into the US. And that really started my international trade. That's where, at 24 years old, I was wandering around Europe buying tires. It was really quite exciting. I never thought I'd be doing that. There was also a real opportunity in waste tire recycling because landfills and all sorts of waste processing really couldn't do anything with tires. I mean, they're built to withstand, not built to just, go by themselves into a landfill. So there was another opportunity. But more importantly, I was still a very young woman, but respected by the other tire dealers in the state. They had known my father and grandfather. And I was elected to be on the board of the National Tire Industry Association as a representative from Connecticut. So there I walked into the room being the first woman and youngest person ever to be on the board, with 49 men who wondered whose wife or daughter I was. I mean, it was incredible. I was very lucky. I had a couple advocates who helped me. But again, I saw a gap in leadership. And if somebody could actually work well with government regulations, and I had worked in the political realm, you could excel. And that really helped me enormously get into working globally with tire recycling. So from there, it was just a question of every time I saw an opportunity, I jumped on it. And maybe that was a little stupid sometimes, but it was where I went and how I got here right now.
All right. So as you know, the percentage of the workforce that's female varies a lot across different industries. It's only 24% in durable manufacturing that's female. So from your perspective, how did being a woman affect your career path, starting out in the tire business and going into other sectors? And how did it affect the way you do business and your leadership style?
Well, my path was unique because I ended up being the head of a company at a young age because I basically took over a family company. But I had to prove myself. I mean, I can remember my grandfather, who was still around, laughing about the fact that if a customer came in and talked to one of the men in the store, and they said, okay, you have a G7814 on your car, the customer would believe it, but I would have to walk out and look at the tire and say, okay, it's a G7814, like I told you at the counter. But, those are the kinds of things that made it harder. But what I learned is I really had to work harder and know more and be the first person with the answer. And I think women have had to do that for a very long time to prove themselves. And it's not as important now because times have changed. But it really is, if you know what you're doing and you're confident in what you're doing, a woman can really do any job they want to do. And families need to tell that. Educators need to say that to women. I was lucky because in my education, both my family, particularly my father and grandfather, and the schools I went to talked about, and I went to women's schools. I went to Catholic girls boarding school, Catholic girls college. But they really taught us that we had to stand up for ourselves and know what we were doing. And in terms of employees, I've been told I'm usually too nice to people. But, I've run businesses where we've had really hard things we've had to accomplish. And my employees have gone above and beyond, I think, because I always cared so much about them. I personally know that I would not have been successful going into a company when I got out of college. I would never have had the success I've had because I probably would have dealt with the 70s and 80s. We don't want women. They're going to have families. They're going to have babies. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. And it would have been very hard for me. Here in Connecticut, we have the most fantastic person who I look up to all the time, who has done such a good job in manufacturing, which is Jill Albertini. And Jill started off as an intern at Pratt & Whitney, and she's now president of military engines. I would expect she's going to be president of Pratt sometime. But she went through the ranks and worked hard and is the single most knowledgeable engineer I know. And it paid off for her because she stood by it and she learned well. The world has recognized 50% of the population are women. And those women can do any job they want to do. And it's really up to us as an older woman to remind them of that on a regular basis. and particularly young women, that you can do anything you want when you want to do it.
Oh, such a perfect message for International Women's Day. So can you talk a little bit about how you went from that tire business into the position as director of the Department of Commerce for International Trade? So that path, how did that work out? And then I'm assuming that there were times when you had assignments or projects in other countries where it was much more difficult to operate as a woman than it is even in the United States. And can you talk about how did you deal with that?
Well, I mean, first, how I ended up at Commerce in 2007. I was pretty much wandering about. We had very successful companies. We were doing the recycling for all the U.S. military tires, but I had been complaining that I was getting a little bored. And a couple of people, some folks in the Bush administration and our local congressional members said, you really should take the position of director at Commerce here in Connecticut, because you're a Connecticut girl, and more importantly, you know international trade, and you know it from a business side versus a government side. So I said, sure, I'll do it for a couple of years, and I spent 13 years and enjoyed it. And the thing I learned most out of that job, and that is really helpful to me right now, is in the morning, I'd be talking to a company that did medical devices, and 2 hours later, somebody who was in defense and aerospace, and another company that did foam boards. And it really taught me how to understand lots of different industries. And that is just, been incredible. But in terms of, where you go and where it's difficult to be a woman, there are areas in the regions in the country, in the world, where women are not accepted as well, and it's cultural. It can, some of the Arab Middle East is not the most comfortable place to be for a woman in business, because as women, American women or Western culture women, we're accustomed to saying what we think and asking good questions, and not having to be told we have to take someone with us if we want to go out in the market to buy something we want to bring home. So that's very difficult. And the U.S. Department of Commerce is very helpful to all companies, but particularly women, when they go into these regions, of helping them with the cultural stuff. You have some Asian countries where they're still feel that men are the decision makers in companies, and that women are not. So that can be difficult. And there are also areas that are dangerous, dangerous for everybody, but particularly dangerous for women. So the Department of Commerce does a really good job helping companies when they're traveling and things like that. So it's not easy to be a woman in international business, because you may find yourself in places that can be both culturally uncomfortable and dangerous.
All right, now for a couple of questions about international trade. So can you talk about the importance of international trade, especially for the state of Connecticut and this region around Hartford?
Well, Connecticut's economy would be in dire shape if we didn't have export markets, because a good portion of our business is export. Our manufacturing sector is really dependent on exports. A large part of that is aerospace. Pratt is a major exporter of engines. And when you think about a Pratt engine is made up of, 95% of the parts someplace else come to Pratt & Whitney to get assembled into that engine. And a good portion of those are from Connecticut companies. So all of those companies are very much dependent on exports. And those same companies also supply Pratt Canada. That's part of where you see our big Canada numbers. General Electric, Rolls-Royce, and other engine manufacturers. So, and those jobs are skilled trade jobs. They're design engineering, they're administration, they're financial position. So when you think about what it takes to build any part, it's not just the person on the floor at the machine, but it's also everyone that designs the part, that sells the part. So when we look at jobs that support exports, It's not just the person who's on the machine making the component. It's every part of that. And there's dozens of other companies, and more than dozens, that export finished products and components, medical devices. We have just such a huge amount of different kinds of things being made in Connecticut. It's a company in Basra, actually in Gilman, on Gilman Road, Gilman Brothers, that make a foam board that is used in all sorts of trade show displays and all kinds of signage that you see in stores and things like that. That company started 130 years ago as a mattress ticking company. We see companies, and they sell all over the world now with their products, but we see companies that have evolved from, anything. There's a company in Meriden that made slip hoops, when there were hoops on women's slips, that now makes aerospace. So we have all of these companies that are here, that have evolved, and that have seen that export markets will help them greatly in what they're trying to achieve and bring employment and innovation, because they'll see that, in Germany, if I change this part a bit, I can be used in this, for something in Germany. So it also helps them innovate.
Right. So, large companies have internal structures to help them with exports. They'll have sales teams, they'll have overseas offices. So for a small company in Connecticut that's interested in developing some export opportunities, how would you advise that they go about them? And is this something that your company outsources?
Well, not everything has an export market. Over the years, I have talked to dozens of companies that have said, "Oh, I want to export whatever," and if what they're making is already in other countries, and there's a local manufacturer of that or a local provider of that, why would somebody buy from the United States? It's just as why would somebody buy a German component if they could buy something made in Bristol? Some of that is competitive. The smaller company just needs to determine if there's a market for the product, and it starts with doing research. And the internet's fabulous. You can do it that way. Also, are there certifications or standards you have to meet to export this product? In anything that's electronic, there are EU standards that have to be made and tested, which can be really costly. So if you've got a product that costs, $10 and you have to spend $150,000 to get your EU certification, how many of those widgets do you need to sell to actually just get past the money you've spent? So that's one of those things that has to be that's important to look at. I always tell people to go to international trade shows in their business sector because you can learn a lot. Often, in my experience, I used to joke that when I would go to international trade shows, I'd probably meet somebody from the United States I'd end up selling to. But it's a great meeting place for people in industry and learning a lot. The government support, the Department of Commerce office, the one that I was in, is fabulous. Best place to start after you do your initial research on their website, which is trade.gov, real easy to find. And from there, the company can look through, what the Commerce Department can do for them, and then talk to professionals in the local office. And it's free. It doesn't cost. It's free. And that's what the government's supposed to do. So, that's one of the important things. Right now, my company is working for the Australian government and with a number of Australian defense and aerospace companies, supply companies, looking to do business in the US. And we do exactly that. We look at their product, we see if there's opportunities, we see what the US competition is. And for many of the companies, we go back and say, there's no opportunity for you. There's already companies doing this. What you have is not unique. You're best off, staying within your own country. And generally, startup companies face the greatest challenges because they really often have a lack of resources. And, because they haven't sold anything in the US, they have no history. Most companies abroad that are buying want to know who your current customers are. And if you don't have current customers, it's hard to show that your product is useful.
All right. So last week, Governor Lamont was on a visit to India and apparently came back with a broken arm. He was with other state officials and business leaders. So in general, what would be the goal of a visit like that? And in this case, why India?
Well, I mean, we haven't heard much other than the broken arm, but he picked India because it probably made some sense. There's impending tariffs, or they may have come in already with India. And India is already a nation where there's a lot of large companies actually investing in the US, building manufacturing, building service sector companies. So, it was a good place to go for him. I'm sorry he broke his arm. And, it clearly was not a business to business trade mission because he didn't have any businesses with him. But, he was in a position to meet a bunch of large companies. I think we'll probably see some reports on that in the coming weeks. But, he was good. He got out in front of it. And I give him congratulations for that. It is an area where there is, investment coming into the US, and Connecticut is a good place. We have a well-educated state, and that's important. Usually the Indian companies looking for skills and education, they're looking to be able to sell their parts and services in the US. And so, it was a good plan on his part, and I hope that he does it in other countries. For many years, we were running off to China every year trying to attract investment. And that really didn't come to a lot in Connecticut, which is unfortunate, but we did get a lot of German investment in. And I know Governor Malloy went to Germany. We've gotten some Swiss investment in. We've gotten a lot of Italian investment in. We've got a lot of British investment in. So it's absolutely worth it. And the states that have done really well, their governors are like, globetrotters. I mean, it's amazing to me. But, I'll be wherever. I'll be in Australia, and I've run into, a number of our U.S. governors who have come out to grab business. And particularly with AUKUS, they're very concerned about getting stuff into their states.
So can you talk about AUKUS a little bit, just in case we have viewers who are not aware?
Okay, so AUKUS is a defense strategy trade agreement with the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. And it has different pillars. One of the major pillars is bringing nuclear submarines to Australia. And in the plan and agreement, the Australians will be buying at least two of our Virginia-class submarines. And they're not going to be the new one. They will be refurbished as of now. And they will be building their own nuclear submarines based on a British design in about 15 years. So these are long-term agreements. There's also an agreement on hypersonic weapons, and RTX is very much involved in that, and Lockheed. So the Australian government is also giving money to the US government to help the Australian supply chain get involved in the US supply chain, which is some of the work that I've been working on. So it's really about our best friends being defense oriented the same way we are. And in Asia, we also now have in Perth, Australia, Western Australia, our submarines are going there now routinely for maintenance and other things. And we have Australian submariners joining our submarines. So we have Australian crews. So we have Australians in Groton, which is really exciting.
All right, thank you. So I think sort of the elephant in the room today is the question of tariffs. And so can you talk a little bit about what effect you've observed over the years in the industries that you've been working in of tariffs, and what your thoughts are about the current tariffs?
Well, we're in a trade war according to this morning's news. And I think the stock market has decided that also. But we're seeing three effects. I'll do the positive one first, because good to start with good news. We are seeing companies that are what we're calling onshoring. Example being Apple, who is investing billions in like Greater Detroit to move their manufacturing here. And other companies are doing that also. Some of the semiconductor companies and other companies. So we are seeing some positive moves that will bring employment and taxes and good things for companies that are going to manufacture here. So basically, there's no tariff on what they're doing. So that's the good news. But we also have this. The second thing is the cost of goods will increase, and one has to remember. And I told a little story earlier how that works. So I'll go to a consumer good. So I go to Ocean State Job Lot and buy tinfoil pans for $1. Great tinfoil pans, very cheap. Now, those tinfoil pans will now have a 10% tariff on them, which means that when they arrive at port coming into the United States, the cost that Ocean State Job Lot buys them at will have a 10% tariff. Now, chances are Ocean State buys those pans for 50 cents. So there will be a 5-cent tariff. Now, Ocean State Job Lot has the cost of transporting those pans to their warehouse and then out to their stores and their store overhead and their warehouse overhead and everything else, and then their basic profit. So that's probably how the pan gets to be $1. Now, the tariff is 5 cents. So basically, maybe that pan will go to $1.05. Or Ocean State may say, well, to keep competitive, we'll take a little shave off of our profit. But it doesn't mean that the pan is going to be 10% more just because there's a 10% tariff. And people need to remember that. Also, on things like machinery and equipment, you will have tariffs on components. So if there's a 10 or 20% tariff on 20% of the components of the piece of equipment, that doesn't mean there's going to be the equipment's going to be 20% more. It's going to be, 5 or 6% more, or 3 or 4% more. So one has to remember what that means. And on some stuff, I've throughout the years in the tire industry, one of the major producers of tires is China. And China has been for 20 years getting anti-dumping tariffs by the US government that have been huge. And often what the Chinese do is they just lower their price to their distributors. So to keep their market. So some of that goes on, and there absolutely will be cost increase because of tariffs. There's no doubt, but it may not be as high as people think. A couple months ago, the World Affairs Council hosted an economist from the Hartford who discussed tariffs and inflation. And even to my surprise, using historical data and analysis, he said that tariffs did not greatly affect inflation. I'm not an economist, but his argument was very good. The third problem we're now going to see, though, is retaliatory tariffs, our trade war. China announced on ag products this morning. So this will impact U.S. farmers. Now, will they be able to take a lower margin? That's part of it. In the past, there actually have been some programs where the U.S. government has helped. And more importantly, we also deal with dollar fluctuations. One of the things that often affects trade is when the dollar is very strong and we sell in U.S. dollars, our products become more expensive. And that's a whole nother thing. So we need to also watch where the dollar goes on this. If our dollar, if foreign currencies are very weak, we have a better buying power. So the dollar affects it along with the tariffs. So, and I'm not an economist, so maybe Rhona, that's more of what your views are than mine.
All right, so we actually have a question from an anonymous attendee. What are some ways Connecticut businesses can increase their resilience in the face of the challenges created by an ongoing trade war? So what are some of the ways Connecticut businesses can increase their resilience?
Well, I think it's one of the ways is the more diverse customers you have, the better you are. I mean, one of the hardest things that many of our aerospace suppliers went through was COVID, when people weren't flying, so aircraft parts. Okay, so the ones that had other customers actually did quite well. So one of the ways the Connecticut companies can ride the storm is to have more domestic customers. Look at customers that maybe are not in some of the tariff war areas, which is a possibility. But it's if there's a tariff, there's a tariff. I mean, there's not a lot you can do about it other than try to increase your domestic business where it's tariff free.
Okay. So you founded Universal Strategies in 1999 as an international business, government relations, trade, and specialty environmental consulting company. So can you talk more about the different types of work that your company does, and other than AUKUS, maybe some of the projects that you're working on?
Well, initially, the company's focus was on international waste tire recovery. And we worked for overseas clients and countries, and mostly on best practices and regulation. There's many countries in the world that are still using the regulations that we worked on for them. When I went over to Commerce, my husband managed the company while I was at Commerce, and over the years, he passed away. And when I rejoined the company, I really did change its what it did. Much less in the tire stuff, and much more into the international trade and support of defense supply chain. So over the past 4 years, we've worked for the Australian companies and done a lot of work for the US DoD on the maritime supply chain workforce development. So right now we are managing a contract for junior achievement that is K through 12 workforce development for maritime industrial base, and it's creating curriculums and really supporting the supply chain companies. So what we're looking at is getting volunteers, supply chain companies, going into their local schools, talking about what they do and why jobs in their companies are good, how they fit into the maritime supply chain. We have all sorts of cool things that show where a very small part goes into a submarine that's got 70,000 parts, and why that part is important to the running of the submarine. So a lot of that, we do that. We work with some Australian companies that are coming into this country and helping them establish. We're doing some work with some medical device companies. I do a little work with an international bank that does some trade and investment. But really, it's about much more trade, investment, and workforce development, and strengthening supply chain companies in the defense sector.
Okay, and now just to go back a little bit to some observations that you can make based on your own experience. So the viewers today probably range from college students, so I hope a lot of our USJ college students are watching right now, to professionals who've had long careers. But for the students and for those who are sort of mid-stage in their career or looking for a career change, given your perspective on lots of different industries, domestic and trade, what advice would you give right now? Where do you think the greatest opportunities are, especially for women?
Well, I think manufacturing is an incredible opportunity. And what we have right now is we have a number of older people retiring. The baby boomers are getting out. So now there's a real opportunity for a number of new people, and the leadership in the companies is getting younger. So they're much more focused on just people who want to work. And that's a key. People who want to work and are smart and who are problem solvers. and manufacturing is expanding all over the country, like Apple in Detroit. One of the things that I will say is if you're flexible with where you can work, the choices are limitless. More and more, I've heard of very successful women when I've gone to events talk about how they were willing to move when their company asked them to move, including moving overseas. And most of them said their overseas work actually helped them get into senior leadership because they learned a lot about what business was globally versus just what business is locally. And that's something that I know is hard. I mean, it's hard. I did it. I moved to the UK, and luckily I had my own company, so I was able to come home almost every weekend. And that's not going to happen if you work for a big company. They're not going to pay for that. But at the end of the day, it does allow you to have a real base and a base of knowledge that others don't have. And so looking at how do you find a job, particularly if you're younger and you don't know what you want to do, I usually suggest to people to go on big company websites and go to their career page. Look at what they're hiring, where they're hiring, and what skills are needed. Because there are all sorts of jobs. I mean, I went through this with a friend of mine's son, where we went through the RTX website. And I was like, wow, those are cool jobs. And these are things that weren't available, 30 years ago because we didn't have the web. But there's so many available opportunities. And it's really just sitting down in front of your computer and looking at them. And if you want to work locally, look at what's on Indeed. Just see what's out there, because then you just know what's out there and you say, oh, I could learn to do that. Many companies have incredible training programs. And they're looking for people who want to work, looking for people who want to come into work. And well, if you're in manufacturing, as in the trades, you're going to go into work every day anyway. But if you're in engineering or marketing or financial, companies are really wanting you now to come into work. So having that ability and saying, I want to work, people just hire you.
So there's a question about long-term shifts in Connecticut's manufacturing landscape. What do you anticipate could happen? How could women lead in this transformation? But I think this also goes back to the question of what industries do you see as being having the greatest potential for growth? Is it biopharma? Other industries where you see the greatest potential?
Well, I mean, biopharma has been a real good leader in Connecticut, and there are people who are doing very well. Much of that is in the technical, as in engineering, biopharma engineering, not so much the trades. In the manufacturing trades, we're heavily defense. We're Sikorsky, we're Electric Boat, we're Pratt, and all of that supply chain. So in the actual trades, it's, welding, machining, but those things are not what they used to be. Much of it is done robotics. So it's understanding robotics. You walk into any of the manufacturing facilities now and they're clean, and, people are there, really running computers. So the landscape is changing that way. And it's really about, I think, understanding what's going on. If you go on to the website, the Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology website, what you see there, which is all of Connecticut companies and their technologies, is astounding. And looking at that will tell you, oh, I'd like to do that, or I'd like to do something else. There's a whole digital thread, which is for engineers. So engineering is still important. And there are probably hundreds of different types of engineers. There's engineers that are mechanical, electrical, material engineering right now is really important because the different kind of composites that are being used on additive manufacturing, the different kinds of materials used in additives. So it's everything from, high school degrees and tech schools up to doctorates in engineering that is making a difference in Connecticut.
So we have a question about tensions around the Panama Canal as they relate to supply chains and global trade. So that's pretty specific, but maybe not just about Panama Canal, but just in general, to the extent that there's tension and uncertainty, how do you see that affecting trade?
Well, I mean, anytime there's uncertainty, it filters down. I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm not an economist. Uh, it filters down. People worry. People worry about their supply. If they're getting, in Connecticut, we do a lot with specialty metals that come from all over the world. Uh, those metals are what goes into aircraft engines and things like that. So if companies can't get the metals they need to manufacture their parts, they're in trouble. So, and that does have to do with shipping and so forth. A lot of things that come into Connecticut by shipments actually come in by air. When there was some of the port issues going on a couple of years ago, I went around to some companies, said, "Oh God, are you worried?" They go, "Oh no, our stuff comes by FedEx. Comes by air." So, I really can't comment on the tensions. Sorry.
That's okay. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that a possibly positive effect of tariffs can be companies onshoring. So you gave the example of Apple moving to a Midwest location. So from the state of Connecticut's policies and regulations, what are things, or maybe it's not just policy and regulations, but what are some things that could be done to try to attract more of that onshoring to our state?
Well, okay, so for a company to want to come to the US, and I worked with an Australian company who's now invested, about $20 million in Portland, Connecticut. It had to do with location in terms of what the business they wanted to do. They needed to have waterway. Okay, so they're at Portland. It had to do, where is their customer? So companies want to see that the location makes sense, that they can hire people. So we have to demonstrate that we have the skilled trades. We have to demonstrate we have a building or land or something for them to be in. We have to demonstrate these days how our connectivity is. I mean, that's becoming a very big thing of, when the connectivity, sorry. And then, what is the logistics? So if it's something that is things coming by road or by air, whatever, do we have the airports? Do we have the roadways to get it in? But labor is very important, because if you don't have a workforce, you can build anything and you won't go. So those are the things they're looking at. I'm sure when the governor went to India, he talked about our available space, our available, we're a well-educated state. Our logistics are good. We've got airports, we've got roadways, we got ports, we have all of that very close in. And then there is the other elephant in the room, which is taxes. We are still an expensive state. We have incredibly high electricity rates, almost the highest in the nation. We have high tax rates. Now, if you're a heavily needing electricity company, that brings a cost in. So that has to be looked at. So all those things are what site planners look at and what companies look at when they come into a state. And we're competing with the Midwest and we're competing with the South.
Mm-hmm. All right, so there's a question about some of the most impactful things you've learned from other women who have been in your place and in the industries that you've been involved in. So what are the most impactful things you've learned from other women?
Well, I have a good friend who is the Consul General for Australia and New York. And she has done incredible things in Australia. And we were in a conversation about mentors. And I said to her, I said, you know, I can't say I've ever had a mentor. And she said, me neither. And what she told me, what we shared, is that we didn't have mentors, we had advocates. We had people who, when we were not in the room, held our case for us in that room, and who did things to say, yeah, you know, this woman is the person to get this done, and she will get this done. And when I thought about that, and I said, yeah, that was it. I said, God, you know, people go, oh, so-and-so was my mentor. And I'm like, I didn't have a mentor. I had advocates. And I think that what you'll find is particularly women in my age and our age tend to say the people who stuck up for them and said that they should get that chance were the ones who actually made a difference. And they were men. They were men. In my case, I had a chairman of Goodyear many years ago say to literally Margaret Thatcher, oh, there's this one young woman in the US and you guys got to find her because she'll solve your waste hauler problem. I mean, that's an advocate. And I've heard that from, and as I've talked about that to other women, they've said the same thing, is that the men who were their advocates were the ones who made the greatest difference in their careers by saying, yes, we should have her do it because she'll do a good job.
So how do you try to do that yourself? And I think we have some people on the call who have been terrific advocates for other women. Donna Collins, for example, is an example of that. So can you talk about the way that you seek to do that for others?
Well, when I was at Commerce, it was actually great because the one thing I found Department of Commerce, women and men, it didn't matter. I mean, there were a lot of women in senior positions, and there was never a question at all. I mean, it was great. I mean, I really liked that. Excuse me. But we had a lot of young women who really needed to be told they were doing a good job. And I think that was the best thing is same thing, talking about how they were doing a good job and you know, getting them into other opportunities. Excuse me. Boy, I've lost my voice.
I doubt that that's true, but
momentarily.
Yeah. So there's another question that relates to this. Aside from having advocates and mentors, what also can be done at a systemic level to boost women's voices and roles in manufacturing and global business?
So sorry. I don't know. I mean, women also have to do their own job. And, you know, go into the trades, go into the skills, and advocate for themselves. I mean, it's not just having somebody else advocate for you, but advocate for yourself. And try to set yourself apart with a good idea or a solution, and not be afraid to bring solutions to people. But, you know, people have to be their own best advocates. You can't leave it up to somebody else. You have to be your own best advocate.
Okay, all right. Well, I can tell your voice is probably going to struggle, and we're almost at the time when people will be wanting to get back to work. But this has been a really terrific 50 minutes with you. I'm so grateful for all of your perspective. Is there anything that you'd like to share before we sign off?
No, just thank you very much for having me. And that, no, this is a wonderful opportunity, and more women should be taking advantage of it.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.